jump right into our next session. So I'm going to ask the panelists and moderator for the next session entitled Iran, Capabilities, Targets, and Modus Operandi to please come to the stage. So Gregg, Ronnie, Jason, Jamil, and Chris, please come on up. And just while they get up here, all of you will be receiving, unless you have already, a copy via email of a report that we just published last week called the Iran Cyber Panic, where we kind of broke down this whole conversation. They'll be probably referring to that paper during the talk, but the paper actually goes into some APT profiles, threats versus the reality versus some of the information that's out there. So we're pretty excited about that. So, gentlemen, come on up.
Good morning. So my name is Chris Burke. I work at the Defense Cybercrime Center, specifically within Defense Cybercrime Center, a directorate called the DIB Industrial Base Collaborative Information Sharing Environment, otherwise known as DICE. Some of the conversation that was just going on, so DICE does have, DICE is sort of like the interface between the federal government and the DIB community, or certain parts of the DIB community. We have a collaborative partnership. So there is information sharing going on. We also received mandatory DFARS reports that are required under the DFARS clause. So I just do want to say that there is that bit of information sharing that does happen. So this panel is going to discuss sort of the aftermath of the U.S. missile strike on General Qasem Soleimani, and so I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves, and we're going to get into some questions.
Hi, good morning. Gregg, Kendrick from Marine Forces Cyberspace Command, the executive director, basically the chief operating officer, chief human capital officer, deputy to the commander. We have 13 cyber combat mission teams that we control, both offensive and defensive. We support General Nakasone and his liaison with U.S. Special Operations Command, all Theater Special Operations Command, and the subordinate commands therein for U.S. Special Operations Command. Support them for cyber mission forces. And then we run and command and control the Marine Corps Enterprise Network, both non-secure internet protocol routing and secure internet protocol routing from that. Organization is about 2,000 people. We're growing as we speak right now, both on the civilian and the military force structure side. I've been doing it for about 4.5 years in that role. So with that.
Ronnie Obenhaus. I also work at DICE. We joke it's the acronym within the acronym, right? So as Chris alluded to, so we work with voluntary partners that come in. We also are the repository for all mandatory submissions that come in. As far as with the voluntary, in order to get industry to participate, we anonymize all information that they bring in and then put it back out, with that anonymization. So that's how we try to get them to collaborate with us.
Great. Hi, I'm Jason Chipman. I'm a partner at the law firm Wilmer, Hale, where I work in our Defense and National Security group. I work on cybersecurity issues, both regulatory side of that and incident response. We regularly handle incidents and advise companies in the private sector, in the government contracting space, in the defense sector, and then other sectors of the economy as well. I also do a fair amount of work around CFIUS and foreign investment in the U.S., and regulatory issues around those issues. Before I came into the private world, I was at the Justice Department for a long time, represented the government in the FISA court, was a national security advisor in the National Security Division, and then a national security advisor to the Deputy AG and the AG.
Jamil, Jaffer. I work at a cybersecurity startup called IronNet Cybersecurity. We were founded by General Keith Alexander, the former director of NSA and the founding commander of U.S. Cyber Command. We deliver network traffic analytics and collective defense products. And I am a recovering lawyer. I previously served in the Justice Department alongside Jason at the Department's National Security Division, as well as in the White House as an associate counsel to President George W. Bush. And I also run a think tank at George Mason University's law school called the National Security Institute.
Okay, so we've got a series of questions, so we'll run through these questions. A few of them will be directed at specific panelists, but then the rest of the panelists can weigh in. And then after we get through the questions, then we'll open it up to audience questions. So first, we'll start with Gregg. Can you discuss Iran's cyber resources and capabilities and how that would compare to other nation states?
Sure. So first off, I'd like to say thanks to Parham and ICIT for having us here and for this panel and getting a chance to interact with y'all. So in regards to cyber capabilities, when you look at 2 plus 3, Iran's not in the 2, right? So kind of just baseline it right there from a foundational aspect from there. And then I kind of broke it down and I look at tactical, operational, and strategic level, where they are in regards to capacity, capability, intent, and then the resources aligned therein. So when you look at the tactical level and you look at Iran, and the report, by the way, does a really nice job that ICIT puts out. So if you look at page 7, it references the Sands and the Aramco and some other, the Italian company as well. I don't speak Italian, so I'd butcher the name. But in there, and it talks about, even goes back so far as talk about the 2012 DDoSes as well. So when you look at their capability, what does that capability have? It has both information technology and operational technology, right? So they have a capability on the tactical level against IT and OT. So in that side of the house, you have to look at that. And then you really look at, okay, well, what have they been given? When you look at Iran and the past history of Iran, what they are is they're focused on things that we have given them through non-compliance. So if you will, the low-hanging fruit. They're pretty easy. They're pretty simple in regards to the Shamoon or the wiper malware, et cetera. They're not a high-end sophisticated, but at the same time, they probably have a capability very small to go there, but it's going to take time. But in the meantime, they're going to take what you give them. And that's what we do. As Director Avenida just said, we give a lot. And so we need to stop giving a lot. So from that perspective, at the operational perspective, when you look at the capability that they have and then also their proxies, right? So they don't directly command and control their proxies, but they are a global capability and a global environment that you need to be worried about. And then if you're in one of the 16 critical infrastructure sectors here, know yourself. So in the Marine Corps, know yourself, seek self-improvement. So know yourself, know your network, right? Know your compliance, know your people that are running your network, your privileged users. We in DoD for the last many years have been really focusing inside and hard on that. And so I'd recommend that you go from that perspective because that's one of the ways they're getting in from that operational level. It is a global capability and they are pretty good at reading and understanding people, but they've grown from their DDoS days. And then strategic, understand Iran is not going anywhere. It's going to be a long time. They're very persistent. They have strategic patience, as is demonstrated at various times, right? Months between the CEO of Sands making a comment and action being taken. Look at right now. They did the ballistic missiles, but at the same time, Director Avenida will tell you they're not going away anytime soon. So they've got some strategic patience. Their proxies might or might not have. So that's something to be attuned to and kind of tune your sensors to the proxies and then stay aware of the flash messages and the other messages coming out from the National Cyber Investigative Joint Task Force or FBI. If you can sign up from that side of the house, create your strategic partnerships, because this is a coalition of the knowledgeable in order to properly defend, right? From that perspective, that's the best way to combat where they're looking at. But I do highly recommend that you know yourself, know your networks, and know your people that are running your networks from that perspective. And then the last thing is, do they have the intent? So capacity, capability I just talked to, do they have intent? Yes. Boom, we know that. Where are they coming at? Resources. They are very stretched on their resources right now, and the sanctions are only hitting them harder. So although they have strategic patience, they can be goaded into lashing out. And that's where you need to be really tuned to where do you and where does your supply chain fall into if they're gonna lash out? Are you in that tactical wave that could get hit in the first side of the house, et cetera? So just be tuned to that. Again, it's knowing yourself and strategic partnerships.
Anyone else? Go on. All right, so kind of building on the capabilities, Ronnie, you're familiar with Iran tactics, techniques, and procedures perspective. Can you share with us regarding specific Iranian activity that DICE has observed and I lost my spot.
So as far as specific stuff, I can't get into a lot of specific stuff based on the reporting that we get, but I can say that with the keynote speaker, I'm happy that he mentioned spear phishing, but I also want to make sure that we enter into this carefully with spear phishing. It's not just blindly clicking on links. Some of this stuff is really sophisticated. they've been known to, and I'm speaking specifically to Iran, right? So they've been known to get into your email and then hijack threads that already exist and then reply to those threads. So, how many people check the thread of your email, especially a long thread, for a reply that sounds like it belongs? Not many. And so we just have to understand that it's not just, these people, they just need training. That's all it is, where it's a culture shift that's going to need to happen. You have to know that you're being targeted, and especially like you mentioned, understand, with these threats, where are you in there? Are you a person that can get targeted? Because so many people might think, oh, well, it's not me, whereas we might have to start changing that. Maybe you are a target, and, so we're important. Yay. So, yeah.
So I think a couple of the recognized TTPs of Iran would be social networking, targeting, also password spraying. Do you mind talking about password spraying versus brute force?
Okay, so password spraying versus brute force. All right, brute force is exactly what it sounds like, right? I'm just going to brute force your password until I get in. Password spraying is kind of more like a low and slow technique, right? They'll take common passwords that exist out there and hit it against a bunch of different accounts in order to avoid lockouts of those accounts. So that's password spraying, and they employ that like crazy. Another thing, which goes back to our willingness to trust. So they use social engineering a lot, especially with things like LinkedIn. How many people blindly accept LinkedIn invitations? That's been, they propagate malware through there a lot. So those are some specific TTPs that we associate with them, as far as spear phishing, hitting people. I know I'm kind of jumping ahead, with like specific targets, but so they'll target aerospace, they'll target energy, especially energy. Defense. So people in there are obviously susceptible, right? But spear phishing and social networking, especially when it comes to things like LinkedIn, so spoof personas, getting in, maybe it's somebody that you recognize, they've just taken that picture. Yeah.
Okay, so that kind of leads us into the next question. So this is for the whole panel. What specific sectors do you see targeted from Iran?
Well, historically we've seen the banking sector, right, financial services, the energy sector, healthcare, the government itself. Those are the traditional sectors we see Iran going after, and there's every reason to think that if they get more active in the aftermath of the Soleimani strike, those are the likely sectors to be targeted again.
Yeah, I would concur with that, especially energy, because that'll help drive their illicit. So as they're trying to do their illicit, oil sales, et cetera, to get their economy back in shape, et cetera. So anything that would help that, they would kind of come after us. But at the same time, if they see an opening, it's kind of like Mostert with the 49ers, right? If he sees an opening in the Kansas City defense, he's going to take it.
Nice Super Bowl shout out.
I was just doing a shout out. I'm a Bears fan, so there you go.
Okay. So this is another one for the whole panel. And Gregg kind of alluded to this earlier. Iran has a reputation for strategic patience. Can we discuss, though, do we think Iran has strategic patience, or might it be some time that they're using for staging or reconnaissance? Some time that they're working to get on a network, or do we really believe that they're waiting for the right spot to hit?
It strikes me from. Am I on? Yeah. It strikes me from from what I've seen from incidents that involve Iran. We've worked on quite a few in the private sector over the last few years. It strikes me that they're in a position to do both. They can be strategically patient. They can look for low-hanging fruit. They can strike, and that although I take a point that they're stretched. I don't have any reason to doubt that. In terms of resources, they're still large enough that I think that they can play the long game and look for targets of opportunity as they arise. That's my instinct.
Yeah, so when it comes to strategic patience, Also understanding what type of APT Iran is. So they've been known in the past that if, let's say you have this group over here that does something, Iran might look at that and automatically sanction it and say, oh, now you get military credit or something along those lines. So while they might not necessarily have this big, where they are commanding every little thing that happens, they are definitely going to support a lot of things that end up coming out. So just understanding that, whereas you have, like a China where they direct to say this is what we're interested in, Iran might not necessarily be that organized. So a lot of it might depend on what they can get. So just understanding kind of differences, and even though we do label them APT, there's different, as you alluded to, different. Yeah, their maturity isn't maybe as sophisticated.
Yeah, so on the CMMI, the cyber maturity, that was a good one. When you look at it, some of the organizations are probably like a 3, others are a 0. So Khomeini, the IRGC Cuts Force might have the long game, the strategic patience, MOIS might be in there. They might not, but their proxies, probably not, right? Because they have to generate funds to be able to go on, and that's probably where they're stretched the most, whereas Soleimani was big in regards to, keeping their proxies well-funded and then in line. As long as they get the resources coming. If those resources aren't coming, then they might feel the need to strike out or lash out or make their own mark in the world to be able to get their funding back in from that side of the house. That's a potential avenue as well. So.
Okay.
Oh, and one thing I would say, it's also referenced in the report, you have to be aware Iranian infrastructure is pretty big and pretty broad, and it's global across the board, but you also could have other actors that are masquerading, that are misusing that infrastructure for their own purposes to either blame Iran or whatnot as well. And so the report does a nice job on the information operational aspect as well. So just, that's another area to be kind of smart on attribution. In the U.S. government, we take a long time on attribution. It was weeks after we came out, until after the Sony attack, that we came out and said DPRK definitively as well, right? Because we wanted to make sure absolutely that it's there. That's not always the case, right? And there might be multiple layers of that. So you just need to be able to have the right technical and operational understanding and viewpoint.
Okay, so with regard to this, the patients, what will U.S. private industry or CDCs, how are they going to defend their networks with this patients in mind?
Well, look, I think it's a great question. I think the challenge that we face today in the American private sector is that we're facing nation-state threats. And historically, we've always assumed that it's the government's job to defend against nation-state threats. When we think about Russian bear bombers, you don't expect Walmart or Target to have surface-to-air missiles on the roof of their buildings. And yet today, when it comes to cybersecurity and cyberspace, we expect Target, Walmart, the mom and shop down the street, and the biggest corporations in America, and frankly across the globe, to defend against all comers, whether it's a single hacker in a basement or a criminal hacker gang or a nation state. And of course, that doesn't make a lot of sense because these companies aren't in the business to do cybersecurity. They're in the business to sell a product to consumers or to other companies. And so the notion that a single company could itself defend itself, whether it's a clear defense contractor or not, against a nation state, it's not realistic. And so if industry is going to be successful at defending itself, it's going to have to come together in organizations working one company with another, industries with other industries, and ultimately industries with governments and governments with allied governments if they're really going to defend themselves against virtually unlimited resource nation states, both in terms of human capital and monetary resources.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think that's the big picture view in terms of what everyone's facing and what communities around the country and around the world are facing relative to these types of threats, APT threats in general, criminal threats from countries like Iran and others. I think looking at it from the perspective of an individual company, it strikes me that means if you're of the right size, you're engaging with those different groups, you're engaging with the ISACs and the like, you're engaging with the FBI, with DC3, with others, with the right constituencies around you. At the same time, and you alluded to this earlier, I think you are taking a hard look at your crown jewels and you're kicking the tires constantly on whether your organization is doing the basics. What we find, so in my job today, I frequently am working on cyber intrusions, frequently very significant cyber intrusions after the fact. And we find over and over again that the intrusion, the root cause, was something that in hindsight, not always, but usually, in hindsight, was relatively minor. It was someone's privileges weren't turned off. It was the system that wasn't patched. It was the old server that everyone thought was decommissioned but was still facing the internet, or something like that. And at one level, you look at that and you think, oh, those people were sloppy. But at another level, I think it speaks to how hard it is to do this right all the time. If you have a big network with thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of endpoints, and dozens and hundreds, thousands of elevated users, it's really hard to get it right all the time. And you have attackers, to the earlier point, that are persistent and constantly probing and looking for weakness. And so the way to deal with that, I think, is to be vigilant, to know the people who are in charge, and to be asking the right questions, and for the C-suite directors, the lawyers, the CIOs, all to be probing and understand how it is they're defending the network, which all sounds easy and basic, but often just doesn't work. And I'll give just one anecdote in that regard. When I first left government and went to the private sector, I worked in a very large breach incident response. And the forensic team that came in told us, I was really struck by this, they said, for this company, they spent huge amounts of money on the best technology. And the board and everyone thought they were doing great because they spent so much money. They were just pouring resources into the problem in their mind. But the forensic person in charge said, but it was kind of like they had bought a Ferrari and given the keys to a 16-year-old who had never driven before. And his point was, they just didn't have the right team. They had all the stuff, and if they turned it on in the right way, they wouldn't have had an intrusion, but they didn't turn it on the right way because they didn't actually have the right people asking the right questions, implementing the tools the right way.
Well, and I think Jason makes a great point, which is, a lot of times we talk about this need for collective security, this idea that companies should work together, industries should work together. But another piece that Jason just mentioned, which I think is a newer, a more evolving concept, is this idea of collaborative defense, right? The idea that it's not just companies sharing information, but it's information to what end? It's information in order to allow individual companies to act on it, but also act on behalf of others. And so if one company takes action and you're collaborating on your defense, you don't need to worry about that. You could say, okay, I'm going to rely on the fact they've got good SOC operators. I'm going to rely on that. I'm going to do it myself in my environment too. And so if we can get companies not just sharing information, which is a great start, but working together in real time, that can really change the game when it comes to defending as a team, and really allows industry to adopt the same practices that the government's adopted in the long run, right? Learning how to fight jointly, learning how to run across and do combined arms operations against the nation-state attacker.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I suppose you sort of see that in the early stages over the last 8-10 years with the DIB and how it's grown. And maybe the DIB companies are the most advanced in that regard.
I would also like to point out, too, and I think this is an important thing, is you'll never be able to mitigate 100%. That's right. It's just not going to happen. But you need to start somewhere, right? So how many organizations out there know all of their infrastructure? Because that's really your baseline. You have to know your infrastructure before you can protect it. Do you have rogue devices on your network? We can worry about insider threats doing over here, but if you don't even know your network, then how are you going to get over there? And so let's not even get to the point of actively hunting threats on a network if you don't even know the network, right? I think there was a statistic that came out that said something along the lines of when a CVE is identified, it's roughly about 12 days before it gets input into your things like Metasploit and things like that. So what's your patch management cycle like? Are you patching within that 12 days? Because if you're not, then you're missing things that just, the average person can just go grab it from Metasploit and throw it out there. Not to mention an active persistent threat that's targeting you. So, it's all of these things combined, and I'm happy that you had mentioned with, we can't do everything, all the time, but we can do some things all the time. So, let's at least try to get one thing like good. It doesn't have to be 100% all the time, but like access restrictions, appropriated user account controls, right? Changing passwords regularly on things that have passwords. Two-factor authentication, that's a huge one. It'll mitigate so many things, of password spraying, because if you ask a user to change their password every 90 days, it's just going to be okay. Shift 1 2, and they're just going to keep doing that. But if you have a token, PIN, boom, so you just there's things that we can do. And I realize that it takes money to do that, and that's why cybersecurity needs to be elevated to that importance, to spend that money on. And also, what you were saying with like buying of tools, there's a lot of organizations that might buy this tool. Okay, this tool didn't work, let's go buy that one. Whereas instead of buying that tool, spend money on training of the tool that you already have. Because you'll be surprised when you get trained on it, it will do the things you want it to do.
So, Jamil, Jason, you guys all got it right, exactly. So just building, when you leave here, what do you want to do? I think you go back to Bill Avenita and you say, okay, hey, so from a boardroom perspective, Chief Procurement Officer gives 2%, right? Not 2% of revenue, but 2% of their intellectual thought. How am I gonna work and help this strategy? Chief Financial Officer does the same thing, right? Chief Human Resources Officer does the same thing. 2%, 2%. Next thing you know, you're at 10 or 12%. By mutual fund standards, that's pretty kick butt, right? But you've really, so from cybersecurity, that's actually pretty kick butt too, because you've now gotten everybody involved and you're thinking. So I think we've all kind of mentioned you can't be everywhere at once. And so from somebody that commands and controls both the offensive side and the defensive side, everybody always says the advantages on the offensive side. The advantage is on the offensive side for the initial access, but you got to hold your ground, right? And so you go back in history, and whether it's any kind of amphibious assault or any kind of assault, holding your ground is actually now really tough. You just flip the scale. Now the advantage is on the defender, right? So if you've got automation in your systems and a behavioral analysis kind of thought process in regards to taking that information out of automation that looks at behavioral analysis and trends within your organization, part of an insider threat, now you're starting to use your cognitive skill set as the human and taking the data that's given and not just relying on the data side, but using the cognitive ability that we have to say that is anomalous, it doesn't look right. Where did it come from, and let's go there, right? And kind of start to get into that. And you're helping your people, you're training your people, you're educating from that. I'm a huge one. You invest in your people, you're going to win every time, right? All too often, we buy the beautiful Ferrari instead of the beautiful 2003, that I still drive, et cetera, because you invest in your people, and I think that really helps you out.
I do want to throw one more thing. I'm sorry. So also, it's been alluded to up here. He talked about it. Keynote. Know what your company makes and who wants it. Because if you make wooden boats and the adversary is stealing rubber ducks, then you don't need to protect against that adversary. Does that make sense? Right? Like, just focus on the things that you can focus on, right? Sorry. A little tangent.
No, it's okay. And it's clear that Ronnie and I work together because I think we both picked up on the same thing. And I appreciated Jason's perspective about talking about how there are seemingly simple things that you can do to defend against these intrusions, yet we at DC3 are getting reports of compromise, and we kind of sit around and we're like, if you had just patched your system, or if you just had dual-factor authentication. So it's an interesting perspective. So sort of that'll kind of lead into the next question for Jamil. There's a difference between defense and deterrence. Can you share your thoughts on this from a strategic and policy level and discuss what needs to be done?
Yeah, well, we've talked a lot about how companies and how governments and industries can defend themselves by getting together and collaborating and working in a collective security arrangement. Well, the same applies when it comes to deterrence, right? A lot of people think, well, deterrence doesn't work in cyberspace. It just failed, right? We can see it's failed out there. The reality is that we don't really practice deterrence, at least until recently. We haven't practiced deterrence in cyberspace. We don't talk about our capabilities. We don't talk about our red lines. We don't talk about what's going to happen when our red lines are crossed. And when our red lines are crossed, we often don't do anything about it. And so it's not that deterrence doesn't or can't work in cyberspace. It's just we don't practice traditional deterrence. Part of that also, comes around the question about attribution. I think Gregg is exactly right. Attribution is an important facet. But there's also something to be said for not getting so wound up about attribution that we hold ourselves to a higher standard in the cyber realm than we do in the real world, right? We tend to think that because cyber is ones and zeros, we can know things with absolute precision. And that's just not the case with sophisticated attackers. We've never required perfect attribution in the case of any international actor, and we launch weapons on the basis of less than perfect attribution all the time. And so in cyber, we ought to apply the same rules, right? And we ought to be free to think about using all tools of national power, right? We often focus on a cyber response to a cyber attack. There's no reason it has to be that way, right? And we need to keep thinking about those issues. And I think that, applying classic deterrence in this realm can work. In fact, we've seen deterrence finally start working with Iran when it came to the strike on Soleimani, right? This is the first time in over a decade across multiple administrations, multiple parties, that we've really decided to actually push back on Iranian aggression, and it showed its ability. Now, it doesn't mean the Iranians aren't going to push back again. They will, and we're going to need to deter again if we're going to have a long-term win there. But deterrence doesn't work if you don't practice it. And so I don't believe this idea that cyber is somehow fundamentally different and the game has changed totally. It's the same game. We're just not playing it the way we used to.
Okay. Jason, some of the technical measures and controls can you discuss some of the technical measures and controls organizations implement to effectively deter and harden their organization?
Sure. I think from my point of view, so I come at this topic from a governance perspective typically, and less from a technical perspective. But I can't tell you how often I get a phone call, or my colleagues do, from a general counsel of a company or usually a lawyer at the company, and they say something like this. They say, our CISO seems great, or our CIO seems great, or whoever it is. And they said they've got all the cyber stuff under control, and the implication is a little that they're kind of saying they want us out of their hair. But I don't really know if they do. And it seems like we have a lot of risks. What should we do? And this often requires me to be something of a therapist, because usually there's some problem that they're not communicating, but that speaks to a real fundamental issue that I think organizations that deal with their data security problems well, communicate well across many different kind of units within the organization. They know at the highest levels how the company is dealing with their cyber security threats. Maybe they're baselining their capabilities against the NIST cybersecurity framework. Maybe they're using the ISO 27001 standard. Maybe they're doing something else. Maybe they've created their own standard and they're auditing against it. But they know what they're doing. They have an answer to those really basic, fundamental questions. And what we usually tell the general counsel, the board, and others is you don't need to be a technician to deal with this problem and address this problem. But you do need to ask the right questions. And there are right questions and wrong questions, I think, to ask. The wrong question is, or the wrong approach is just, well, the CISO said they've got it, and nothing more. That's not a responsible thing to do. And I think organizations that do this really well are really cognizant of this dynamic, and they're focused a lot on what are the right questions to ask, and they're coming from the highest levels of the organization.
Okay, so this one's for the entire panel. What are your thoughts on the risk of unilateral action by Iranian proxies?
So I think the risk is pretty high for Iranian proxies, especially as the resources continue to get constrained and the networks continue to get squeezed by us with our sanctions and our coalition partners, et cetera. I think they're going to need to feel the need to be able to draw attention to themselves and their organization to be able to get recruitment in and resource driving, et cetera, from that perspective. If I could shift real quick, too, because I want to tweak Jamil and Jason a little bit, because that's a different version of the Department of Justice than I have heard before in regards to not requiring persistent or, exceptional attribution from that side of the house. And so I'm not actually a believer that deterrence in cyber works. And so I just wanted to proffer the counter argument. And that is, so when you look at kinetic world, so I'm a kinetic targeteer in addition to non-kinetic from uniform days. The reason we've gotten away from general purpose and general bombing is because it creates more adversaries than it actually achieves our end states and our goals, right? So we've gone to precision, hence the precision munitions. Even in hypersonics, we want everything to be as precise as possible and focused on leadership, et cetera. And then when you look at large groups, right, you want to identify their leaders and be as precise as possible. If we would take offensive action without good attribution, we would generate a lot, and just go against infrastructure emanating from certain areas, et cetera. I think that has the capability to really generate a large amount of antibodies and or criminals that would then join off or join with in a coalition that would backlash, and the U.S. government networks are actually pretty well defended, I think, so it would really go against the business side of the house, right? And so that's why we're trying to be so precise. When the U.S. government takes action, we want to be as precise and as right as possible to be able to establish that moral high ground. And I do think we need to establish and maintain a higher standard than the rest of the world because we are the best country, best republic in the rest of the world.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with that. Look, I agree 100% that we need to be precise and careful in our targeting. What I'm saying is that we shouldn't expect from ourselves in the cyber realm something different than we expect in the kinetic realm, right? Today, we hold ourselves to an extreme standard in the cyber realm. We think we need to know exactly 100% for sure, no question. We didn't require that. We didn't need to have a tech cut, right, an audio signal of Muammar Gaddafi ordering the bombing at the Berlin discotheque to go bomb his house and ultimately kill his adopted daughter, right? We knew it was the Libyans, and we took action, okay? And I don't think that in the cyber realm, you're going to ever effectuate deterrence unless you get ready to go on the offense. We finally decided as a country to get more offensive and get more aggressive, and I think our defend forward mission, our persistent engagement mission is exactly the right one, but if we stayed on our back haunches and we kept playing defense the way we have for the last decade, right, we were never going to get ahead of this threat. And so, look, I'm not disagreeing. Precision's important, right? But it's also important to not require ourselves to do something we don't do in the physical world.
And so I would agree with that. Although I still think we're a learning organization, and we should continue to push the boundary. So when you look at the kinetic strikes and the nuclear deterrence policy we have, that was all generated by academia. And I would say that is a huge gap that we have, is the education here inside the United States, right? To feed the departments or the National Security Council staff guidance from that perspective. We don't have that academic thought and influence on what is deterrence and what is an authorized first strike or other capability in regards from a cyberspace. It is different than kinetic. So we need to get academia involved from that perspective. And where's the next Dr. Kissinger for cyber?
Might be Mr. Chipman here on the right.
No, it's probably Jamil. No.
Yeah, I have a question, Greg. You stated that unilateral action is driven by Iran proxies. Is that an argument, driven by sanctions, is that an argument for lifting sanctions or removing some sanctions?
No, I don't think it's an argument for lifting or doing it. That's a national policy, and I'll follow within that. I think you just need to be aware of as the situation gets pressurized. People are going to make their own independent thoughts and decisions instead of staying part of the team, right? And when you look at the NFL, right, when teams start to go down and get bad, you see the individuals come out instead of the team unity of effort. That's all. That's my allegory.
So it's really interesting. It's interesting you have that perspective, Greg, because I actually had the opposite instinct. Obviously, Greg has got access to a lot more intelligence on this stuff than I do. But my instinct was always that in a scenario where the Iranians have their back up against the wall, they're more likely to more tightly control their proxies, right? I think this is a big question about how much control the Iranians really have over their proxy groups, right? Whether we're talking about Hezbollah, Kataib Hezbollah, or others, right? My instinct is the Iranians do a pretty good job of controlling the flow of weaponry and capabilities of those groups, particularly the cyber realm. And so it's interesting that you have the opposite instinct on that. So I'm interested to hear more about that.
So pre-Soleimani, Jamil, I would have agreed with you. Post-Soleimani, I think he had the gravitas and the character, if you will, that kind of kept that reign. And now without him, that's why I don't think, and I don't think his deputy has the same, gravitas and character, et cetera, to be able to hold people again when the situation gets pressurized.
So it's a new evolution post Soleimani.
Correct.
That's a really interesting insight.
Okay. Trying to decide if we should go in with the proxies question. We kind of covered that a little bit. Let me just ask this question sort of specific to the proxy.
We have time for one final question.
One question? Yeah. All right, let's, you want to just do audience questions or the panel questions?
Probably the last question of the panel.
Okay. Okay, so we've seen numerous warnings come out from public and private sector organizations regarding the threat from Iran. In your opinion, has anything changed with regard to our risk from Iran?
No.
I'm curious about the other responses, but no, I wouldn't think so. I mean, well, perhaps the risk has gotten greater because of the reasons we've been talking about in this sort of pressure cooker environment. But for most private organizations, I think they're effectively in the same boat they've been in.
So I think the answer is yes, and I'm not saying to be different, which I realize I've been doing a lot today. But the reason I think the answer is yes is twofold. One, I think in the cyber realm more than in the kinetic realm, Iran's more likely to act out now, particularly because we have engaged in some measure of deterrence against them when it comes to kinetic realm. And cyber in a couple of ways is different, right? One, it's plausibly deniable, even though the Iranians want you to know they did it, right? They also want to be, well, maybe it wasn't us. Maybe your attribution's wrong. Maybe it's hard to know. And so they want to muddy the waters a little bit, all the while being able to sort of have shown that they can push back. And cyber gives you a sort of a fairly unique capability to do that. And the second piece of it is it's dynamically ratchetable, right? So you can easily ratchet up and down from DDoS to destructive to debilitating and all the way back to just a nuisance. And so they can up and raise and down in a way that kinetic is a lot more binary, right? Yes, it's true. You can size the type of the device. You can decide on a terrorist attack regionally. You can decide to do something domestically. But at the end of the day, cyber's a lot more ratchetable, right? And that's why I think the Iranians are more likely today to use that as a weapon of first choice, particularly in response to in the post-Soleimani world, than they are any other thing. I think the next most likely thing is a in-region terrorist attack. I think they recognize a domestic terror attack is a lot more problematic. But I think cyber's the next place they're going to spend a lot of time focused on.
So I'm with Jamil, actually. So I would say yes, 3 reasons. They need to show that they're still doing something. They need to show their people they're still doing something, even if though they'll say on the other side, hey, it isn't us. I think they need to help their economy, and so they're probably going to hit something to do with energy to be able to drive the price of oil so they can help their illicit oil sales, et cetera. And then the third thing is it might not be Iran. But I do think Putin, he's a wily cat, and he's an enemy of us. Right, and or she, who's a long thinker, or some criminal element will use Iranian infrastructure and or tools to be able to just continue to prod us because that opening is there, and we're all expecting something from Iran. So for those 3 reasons, I would say yes, the situation has dynamically changed.
Okay, and then just a quick plug. So for DICE, so we've actually released several warnings following this missile strike, and we've released lots of indicators to our defense industrial base partners, so there are lots of warnings going out. So we'd like to open up to audience questions. No? No audience questions? Okay. All right, well, thank you to the panelists. Thank you, Parham.
Thank you.